Welcome, everyone. Before we begin our conversation, I'd like to mention a couple of housekeeping items. First and foremost, live interpretation is available for today's webinar. To activate the translation function, go to the bottom of your screen, click on the globe, and select your language.
Buenas, bienvenidos a todos a este webinario. Antes que nada, debemos decir que va a haber interpretación simultánea disponible utilizando la función de interpretación de Zoom. Una vez esta esté encendida, van a hacer clic en el globo que va a aparecer en la parte inferior de su pantalla o en el menú desplegable de los tres puntitos que dicen More o Más. Seleccionan Interpretación, seleccionan su idioma y pueden poner en silencio el audio original. No van a ver el globo hasta que Yvonne no encienda la función. Okay, we're ready for the interpretation feature to be turned on.
Thank you. So if you have any questions, please enter your question in the Q&A function, and we will answer as many questions as possible after our moderated conversation. So once again, welcome to Fairfield County Talks Housing, a program of the Fairfield County Center for Housing Opportunity. I'm Yvonne Klein, founder of Fairfield County Talks Housing, and I'll be your moderator today. Fairfield County Talks Housing provides fact-based conversations with the experts and leaders in the fields of housing, affordable housing, and zoning. Today's topic is Housing Advocacy 101. And so we're going to spend time on how to advocate on a state level, and we're going to try to talk a little bit about how to advocate on a local level as well. So the 2025 legislative session is in full swing. It began on January 8th. So committee meetings and public hearings are being held and they're on the calendar. Organizations are holding press events at the Capitol. Lobbyists are working on behalf of their clients, and advocates and activists, that's us, we're showing up in a number of ways. And most important of all of this is the showing up. And we're going to talk about how the most effective ways on how to do that today. So as I mentioned, not only are state elected officials addressing housing and zoning issues, it's happening in our hometowns as well. Local planning and zoning commissions, they continue to review applications and hold public hearings for multifamily housing, both market rate and affordable. Those applications need your support too. I'm also there's a lot going on today, so I'm going to direct you as well to the chat because we're going to be providing information for you to learn more about proposals that housing and zoning advocacy groups are supporting. We'll also be providing links in the chat for how to find your legislator and a link to the Connecticut government website. So there's a lot of information that we'd like to get to you today. So just some basics. I mentioned public hearings. I think most of us know what a public hearing is. So it's a public hearing, whether it's at the state legislature in Hartford or in your own town. It's an opportunity for you to be heard by your elected officials on the matter before them. So it's important to either speak or send in written testimony. So that's the one thing you're going to hear a lot of today is to speak up, sign up and speak if you can, or send in written testimony and other activities that can help you while advocating for important housing and zoning legislation. Sometimes the Connecticut website can be confusing, at least maybe it's just me, but I find it a little confusing. So we have some slides to demonstrate how you find out when public hearings are being held so you can participate. So I'm going to go to Emma for the slides. Okay, great. So here's the Connecticut, and again, we're going to put the links in the chat for you. So here you have the Connecticut website. And this is what it looks like. Our snapshot was, and then when you scroll down, So this is from February 7th. You see a list of things that you can select from, My Bills or the bulletin. We typically go to the bulletin. And then as you see, that's what it looks like. And then if you go to the top, you're going to be looking for public hearings. And, here you can see the list of public hearings. And this is for government administration. This is for the Housing Committee for February 13th. There were public hearing, there was a public hearing for the Housing Committee, and you see the bills. You look for your bill number. And here we have circled the online testimony registration form. And here you go. And this is what it looks like to sign up to give public testimony, which you can select via Zoom or in person. Okay, again, testimony submission form. I mentioned you could also submit written testimony if you're unavailable. So this is pretty simple. Again, you fill it in, your name and so on. You select the hearing date. And what's important here, support or oppose. And you can scroll down as you look on the left-hand side, bill number, and you look for your bill. You can type in or upload a file to submit your testimony. And then, of course, you can scan this QR code. Great. Thank you so much, Emma. I hope folks found that helpful. So if you do sign up to testify either in person or via Zoom, typically 5 o'clock the night before, you may receive an email or with your number. Because in some cases there are quite a few people who sign up to testify, or you could go to the Connecticut government website to look for your name on the list. So that's a quick tutorial on how to testify, how to submit testimony, and sign up for all of that on the website for the General Assembly. And if you wanted to participate locally in a public hearing in front of your Planning and Zoning Commission, not all towns' websites have been created equally. So I would just recommend that you go to your town website and click on the Planning and Zoning Commissions, look for their agendas, or click on the town calendar, and you will be able to see when public hearings are occurring. So I hope that's helpful. And if you have any questions, certainly let us know in the Q&A function. So with no further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome our panelists, Pete Harrison, the Connecticut Director of the Regional Plan Association, Kirk Wesley, Senior Organizing and Outreach Coordinator for Open Communities Alliance, Calder Hudson, organizer for the Connecticut Tenants Union. He is subbing today for Luke Milanikos Harrison, and Giselle Chavez, housing equity organizer from Make the Road. So welcome, big welcome to our panelists. And with that, we will get to our questions. So Pete, first question for you. What's your advice if someone would like to testify, this is in person or via Zoom? Could you talk a little bit about that? What should I say? What should I expect? Is there a time limit? So could you help us out with that?
Yeah, sure. And, I think pretty much everybody on this channel had a pretty late night, partly because of some of this. But historically, to testify at a public hearing at the General Assembly meant physically being there in the committee space. And what that typically meant was pretty small amounts of people could participate, or really, lobbyists, activists, folks that are really motivated one way or the other on a particular bill. And certainly during the COVID era, that changed. Everything was all virtual during the peak of the pandemic. And since then, there's still been this residual hybrid structure, which in a basic way means a lot more people can participate because you don't have to be there physically. On the downside, as we saw last night, it can mean things can kind of go long in some cases. So I think there's a little bit of a delay in terms of the General Assembly figuring out how to bring more people into the process, which I think most of us agree is a very good thing, but really respecting people's time. I didn't testify until 2:30 in the morning, and that was rough. But the general process, whether you do it in person or virtual, is the same. And as Yvonne already did a really good job of explaining, there's a public notice goes out of the committee where the bill is coming up that you want to support or oppose, or multiple bills. There's an opportunity the day before the hearing to sign up. It's actually a Zoom login, regardless if you do it in person or on Zoom, which can be a little bit confusing, but you do have that option of picking which one. Generally speaking, and for most folks that are just really passionate about housing, I would opt for the Zoom option because you just don't know, for a lot of bills that we're working on, when you're going to go. So that's a downside of it. At least doing it on Zoom gives you a little bit more flexibility to plan around it. But regardless if you're in person or virtual, there's that list that comes out the night before with your number. And generally, the clerk in the committee that's running both the virtual option and the in-person option will list out the name of what number you're going to go. Everybody gets 3 minutes, whether they're the governor or a 16-year-old advocate. So preparing for your 3 minutes, that's uninterrupted. A lot of folks will sometimes write written testimony, submit that for written testimony, but also read that out. That's totally fine. Oftentimes people are just passionate and riff. There's no formula to it. Generally speaking, polite, professional, on task for the particular bill is the end of it. And after that 3 minutes, you may be given opportunity to ask, to answer questions from committee members, depending on who's in the room and what the relationship is. That will shift. 2 o'clock in the afternoon might have more questions than 2 o'clock in the morning, since folks are the representatives are kind of coming in and out as well. But a lot of folks that are really just passionate about a particular housing bill are going to be very intimidated about this process. And generally, groups like the folks on this panel have been really good about providing those resources, both just the mechanics of how to get yourself to testify, and then helping you figure out what you want to say or what are the key points. Generally speaking, we're not expecting folks to be experts on the legalese of any particular bill. A lot of this is story driven of why are you passionate about this issue and why would this bill improve your community's situation, your personal situation. So that's really what I think a lot of advocacy groups recommend is don't worry about being experts on the legalese of any bill. Frankly, most legislators aren't even experts on it, but speak about your experience and your story, and that's going to be powerful, both in written form and at the virtual or in-person hearing. Legislators that agree with you really want to hear those stories, and really need to hear that, particularly in Fairfield County. A lot of times the legislators know it's good policy, most of these things, generally know it's good politics, that they're not getting voted out for voting for these things, but just aren't hearing from a lot of people that support these ideas compared to opposition. So showing up and testifying, even if it's 30 seconds and you're mumbling and nervous and not an expert on it, is going to matter. And I think, really credit to the tenants union last night in particular, bringing a lot of folks out. It's an overwhelming force to have that many people, as annoying and long as it is for folks organizing it and participating in it. So there are a lot of opportunities to do so. As a basic recommendation, particularly in a big housing bill that tends to be a little bit more controversial, going virtual is the best for your own structure. And the one thing I'll just say practically too is if you do miss your number, you can get back on. It's not do use it or lose it. It is formal and structured, but it's still pretty informal and accommodating. So generally speaking, particularly if you're virtual, you can hop on the link that you got and they'll work you in. So there's a lot of unpredictability about it. There are probably some good ideas to how to solve that for people, but it is a lot more flexible and not as scary as you might worry.
Great, thank you. That was a thorough answer. Thank you so much. So Calder, I'm going to go to you, and I think this is probably a shorter answer. And as I had mentioned earlier, we're going to put a bunch of links in the chat for folks. So just generally speaking, where can I find factual information that's easy to understand with respect to the various bills? Is it with the organizations that will be featuring, your organizations, and again, with the links? Is that where we can find that kind of information?
It's a very good question, because I think that's where a lot of people who are new to this process want to start out. And I think with that, in that respect, there's sort of two answers. There's the organizational answer, and then there's the mainline answer if you aren't party or you want to try and get this information yourself without being part of an organization. And the Connecticut Assembly has its own answer in this regard, which is the Office of Legislative Research, which is accessible through the website that we've detailed already. And their goal is essentially to try and present the language of bills in plain and understandable English, and to try and break down the impact these bills will have on existing statutes in the state, and to also try and go through the public testimony and to try and sort of like make a shorthand consensus for what the public's consensus is on an issue, which is all very valuable. And that department is presented as a non sort of partisan, objective, fact-driven group. And I think that most people would agree that they do a good job in that respect. But ultimately, they're reactive. They're going to be responding to information. Like in the example I just gave, if they're feeding back on public testimony, you'd be waiting for the public testimony to conclude to get their take on it. And that's, also accommodating the fact these things take time to summate and collate. So I would say that for most organizations that are concerned about an issue, we try and provide easy, understandable, recognizable material to people who have stories like the ones that Peter was describing, and who want to make an impact on policymaking on these issues. So in our case, for instance, we would run seminars on what these things are, common complaints you might see about a piece of legislation, what ordinary questions and what impacts a bill might have. And I think a lot of organizations follow that same structure. And even if you're not looking at it from an organizational lens, in your community, there will be other people who care about these issues as well. And some of them may have already testified in the past. Some of them may have significant expertise. Many of these bills spent multiple years in development in both branches of the Legislative Assembly. So I think that because organizing with other people and learning and educating and being involved in your community is so integral to all of the work we do on housing in particular, I would advocate looking in your own community and through organizations you trust that you feel reflect what you want to see achieved in the state of Connecticut for the information you're looking for. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Kirk, so how do I connect? I want to get involved. How do I connect with the various advocacy organizations? And again, we'll be putting links, but a link is one thing. What else can I do? I mean, Calder mentioned connecting with folks in our communities. What else can we do? What else is there for us to connect with these advocacy, with your organizations?
Yeah, great question. And thank you for having me here, Yvonne, and happy Black History Month to everyone. And appreciate the opportunity to share with you. So again, great question. And I would say that connecting with advocacy organizations, that requires like a multifaceted approach. And it includes relationship building, strategic collaboration, and engagement with broader housing justice efforts. In Connecticut, there's a diverse ecosystem of organizations that are working on housing issues like affordability, tenant protections, as Calder just mentioned, homelessness prevention, fair housing, and equitable development. So there are like 4 key strategies that I think work well for connecting with organizations. Number one is mapping the landscape, and you got to identify the key stakeholders. So there are a variety of different organizations that are working on a variety of different housing related issues. When you think about organizations like the Connecticut Fair Housing Center or Partnership for Strong Communities, Desegregate, Open Communities Alliance, the Make the Road. There's just so many different organizations that are working on housing issues. So you want to take a look at what you're focused on and what you want to get into. Either it's tenants' rights or more homelessness solutions, discrimination. It's really what you're into and what you want to be active into, and figuring out what's the organization that kind of works on that. I also recommend looking into like faith-based organizations, community land trusts, grassroots coalitions, and legal aid groups. They also are a good place to start. Number two, I would say like create open communication and direct relationships with these organizations. Attend their public meetings, webinars, or legislative briefings. Reach out to the leadership teams or organizers and really try to get a better understanding of the work that they're doing. Ask how you can support. That way it's not just a one-way kind of relationship. It's mutually beneficial. And I think that this approach creates a relationship that's more mutually beneficial than transactional. And we want to make sure that we're being beneficial to the group that we want to support, as well as get information from them. You want to participate in advocacy campaigns and different coalitions. So in Connecticut, they have different coalitions that are working on housing issues. You have Growing Together Connecticut, Home CT, the Connecticut Coalition to End Homelessness. So there are a number of different coalitions, so you can join, get involved, and that way you can stay informed on policy developments and be involved in advocacy campaigns like public hearings that happened yesterday. And this is what connecting with these organizations will help you to do. You can also follow the General Assembly's Housing Committee for updates, and you can kind of see what these organizations are supporting or opposing and things like that. And the last thing I'll say is leveraging community networks and grassroots organizing. I think that this is super important because beyond formal organizations, you can just connect with local residents, tenant associations like Calder works with, and just organizers in your community. There's a great group in Bridgeport, PT Partners. That's an example of groups that are leading the efforts on the ground that are making things happen in the community. So those are good groups to connect with. And last thing I'll say is advocacy around housing is sustained. It's not just one-off interactions. You have to be actively involved, actively listening, and showing up consistently. And that's a good way to get involved and stay involved and build meaningful relationships.
Thank you, Kirk. Giselle, part of your work is organizing communities. How do you do that with respect to galvanizing folks to go to Hartford to advocate for housing issues? So I was up there, we were up there a couple of weeks ago. Make the Road was there and holding an event, a press event there. So how do you galvanize your folks to go to Hartford to advocate for these housing issues?
Yeah, so good evening. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Yvonne, for having me here as well. And I think that first of all, it's important to always like advocate to the communities that are going through the struggle, right? It's important to target those communities so that these communities can be able to use their voice up in the Capitol when we go and do the press conference, public hearing. And like I believe Pete was saying, these voices are the voices and the stories that need to be heard, and not anyone can tell these stories but them. So that is like a little bit on how like this whole process of taking them to Hartford and taking members up there and being able to advocate for housing issues, right? Also, I think it's also connecting the fact that these housing issues are the ones affecting them, right? If there's no one advocating for these housing issues, if there's no one in the community saying these are the changes we need, this is what we want, there's not going to be a change. Our voices need to be heard for there to be change. We have to be up there in the Capitol advocating for the issues that we want, the housing issues that we're going through, especially, for example, Just Cause. We was advocating for Just Cause in a press conference. We just had public hearing yesterday. And it's hard, right? It's hard, especially when you work with the undocumented communities. It's hard to be able to like have these undocumented communities come out of that shell where we feel like fear of like discrimination, fear of what might these people say, right? It's very hard. So I think it's respecting their stories, respecting their rights, and for them teaching them their rights, that they have the right to go up there and be able to share their story, be able to tell them what is affecting them in their community. So I think the important part is being able how to respect the person you have as a member and as a person that's supporting the changes that we want. And it's also giving them the knowledge of what can these changes do? How do you want to see your community in a year, in 2 years, in 5 years? Like those changes that you want, always start by us. If we don't get up and start fighting for what we want, we won't win the fight. And sad, like this Just Cause this year was a bit harder. As we know, like the language, it did change a little, where to the part where Bridgeport, it made it harder to advocate for Just Cause, just because Bridgeport is one of the cities that also kind of like stands out of the bill because it has less than 5 units. The current bill is protecting 5 more units. So, like, how do you tell a tenant that is not going to get protected to come to the public hearing and say, hey, help us fight for these tenants, right? But I think the importance is helping all the rest of the tenants being able to get protection, and letting those tenants that aren't going to get protected know that the fight isn't over, that there's another year and there's more years. Yes, we might not fall under this protection, but who are we to say that we can't fight to for that protection next year? So I think it's also involving the motivation, keeping the motivation and giving them that motivation that, we as organizers, or myself as an organizer, I'm not gonna let my community down just because they didn't they can't get protected now. So I think it's also the motivation, and definitely how reflecting the issues on the community to what we're fighting for up in the Capitol.
Well, I think you raise a good point that, we need, as advocates, all advocates are successful when we adopt a broad agenda that can help the most, and then maybe later come back and deal in the details. So appreciate those comments. So, but we know public hearings are occurring on bills. There was one yesterday, there was one a couple of weeks ago. And what happens if I miss a public hearing? Like, is there anything else I can do if I miss the public hearing? I missed the deadline. I didn't sign up to speak. I didn't get my written testimony in on time. So what can I do? Can I reach out to my own legislator? We heard from Bob Duff and the housing co-chair and the P&D co-chair last month, that contacting our own legislators is really important. So if we've missed the public hearing, should I still contact the housing committee and reach out to my legislators with an email? Kirk, I think you unmuted.
Yeah, I can jump in here.
Yeah.
I think it's absolutely important for you to continue to reach out to your local legislators. You can reach out to the housing committee. And even if you can't attend the public hearing, I think it's important for you to submit written testimony as well. And there's always a longer window to be able to submit written testimony. Public hearing is usually just for a day, or as the longer ones, they go into the next day. But written testimony, you have a window really like up until they take the voter, until it's voted out of committee, to submit written testimony. And written testimony is absolutely effective and it's valuable. It's a great way to make your voice heard. Legislators and their staff, they still review those written testimony to understand public support or opposition to a bill. And written testimony becomes a part of the official record. So that your testimony is there to go back to. Legislators and advocates often cite a written testimony. You can actually go online to see the written testimony that's submitted on a particular bill. So written testimony is an effective way to get your voice heard if you're not able to be a part of the public hearing. You don't have to write a 5-page paper. Honestly, it's better if it's maybe 1 to 2 pages max, where you're very clear, direct, concise, and to the point. So that's something that's an effective way to reach legislators if you aren't able to attend the public hearing.
I think I can also jump into real quick. Yes, I definitely did love what Kirk said. As well, I think I can also motivate people to even reach out to their reps and their senators and tell them your stories, or even on these organizations that you can make contact with, which are doing like the work up in the Capitol. You can also sometimes, for example, I know Just Cause might have lobbying days, and I know all these other campaigns can also have lobbying days where you can also, you know, join these lobbying days and be able to advocate to the legislators up in the Capitol, as well as what Kirk mentioned before.
Great. Thank you so much for that. Because that's important to know, that folks could still be heard even though they do miss the public hearing and the fun of staying up till 4 a.m. So thank you. Appreciate that. So, we talked about this a little bit with the first question. If I'm testifying in person, most folks aren't experts on these bills. Most folks, we're just regular people. What if a legislator, and I've noticed that legislators have been asking tricky questions of people, and most people do pretty well, I will say this. But what happens if you really can't answer that question and you know nothing about what they've asked you because it might be too technical, and you just don't have the expertise? Is it okay to say, I don't know? Like, how do we handle that?
I'll jump in there after the events of the last few days, because I think you're right. I mean, I think that being realistic about this, there are people on some of these committees who essentially don't want to hear from the public on matters that they themselves do not agree with. And I think as you say, one of the things they'll sometimes do is try and bait members of the public into making a mistake or losing their composure. And some of them are very, very good at this. They've had a lot of practice. They have, unfortunately, for better or worse, they have a lot of stamina. And it's a method that they use. Then sometimes they will specifically go after people who they think are newer to the movement or who they don't recognize, to try and kind of get them out on some technicality, as you say. And I think earlier Pete made a very, very good point, and I want to revisit it in this respect, which is one of the most compelling things you can do in these testimonies is be yourself and present your story, your lived experience to this committee and say, hello, I'm here on my own time as a member of the public to say why this matters to me. You don't necessarily need to get up there with all of the most up-to-date statistics on the issue that you're discussing, but if you are presenting your own personal story, it's going to be very difficult for some bad faith person to try and catch you out on technicality. You will be the expert in your own lived experience. No one there is going to know you better than you do. So you are well within your rights if you get asked a bad faith question, or a question that is just befuddling to you because it's overly technical or sort of inside baseball, to say, I can't speak to every aspect of this issue. I'm here to explain my skin in the game, why this matters to me, and why I think there's something that needs to change in the way we do things here in Connecticut. And I think also doing that in the face of, worst case scenarios, sort of like bad faith critique or technicalities, in itself holds a lot of power and can be really encouraging to people who can't be there on the day of. And I think that with that in mind, you'll always be doing that from a position of strength in the community that you're part of. So if you're there to represent the community, that's your area of expertise, your own life and the lives of those you care about. So.
And I'll add on too. I mean, there is often a game within a game with these public hearings, and sometimes it is very intentional to make them go as long as they can. And there are a couple of things happening. One is to signal to the rest of the chambers and governor's team that there's strong opposition to something, and it's going to be a talker. And talkers mean it's extra time on a calendar where there's already thousands of bills going through, and trying to make it look like, oh, this one's going to be such a time suck that we shouldn't do it. So oftentimes, some of those folks will, good faith or bad faith opposition, really try to drag things out and make a bill become a talker, which could signal to the leadership this isn't worth it compared to other times, other bills, because of limited time. And yeah, the other aspect too, Calder had mentioned, is these are very controversial issues around housing. It's emotional, it's economic, it's racial, it's a lot of different things. So people have pretty strong opinions and takes on it. They're very politicized, really every state, but certainly in Connecticut. So oftentimes there will be, folks that are really against something that will know where to pick the softer underbelly of a movement. A tenant's right attorney might get their 3 minutes and not get asked a question because they're going to know the answers to stuff. Whereas somebody else that maybe looks more vulnerable might. So oftentimes the best solution is just to say, nope, I don't know, and leave it at that. Don't stumble through, don't get dragged into it. Recognize the game within the game. Don't take it personally. Just say, Senator, Representative, I don't know. And leave it at that to keep things moving.
That's great. And that's good advice, because it can be intimidating when you testify. I can definitely say that. So I just want to remind our audience, if you have any questions for our panelists, please put your questions in the Q&A function, because we'd like to answer any questions that you might have if we miss something here. So, this is something we talk about a lot. Is it worth our time? Is it worth my time, people will ask, to contact legislators who might be opposed to a specific piece of housing legislation? So, maybe my state rep or my state senator is opposed to a piece of housing legislation. Do I email them? Do I call their office? Do I do that? Should I contact, if you've sent in testimony or you've testified, you have reached that committee, right? We're going to pick on the housing committee today. You've reached out to the housing committee. You have some folks who may be opposed to a particular piece of legislation, so they're going to get your testimony anyway. But is it worth my time to reach out to perhaps my state legislators who may be opposed to housing or zoning changes?
Yeah, I'll jump in here. Yeah, I think it's absolutely worth your time. But I think how you approach them matters. Legislators are humans, right? So they can still change their positions, right? Like opposition isn't always rigid. So sometimes it takes lawmakers like hearing from folks and maybe getting better information, better perspectives from constituents, or maybe even political cover in their district to make sure that they can make a strong stance. They might not support the bill as it's written, but maybe you can open them up to making amendments and things like that. I also think it's important because you can build relationships for future legislation. I think we live in like a society right now where everyone is just in their own silo, and only talking to people who agree with them. But I think if you're able to really talk with a legislator who has maybe not agree with you on this particular thing, but you can build a relationship with them for something in the future, recognizing that this person still has influence, they're still an elected official, and ultimately at some point down the road, you might can find common ground on the issue. So I think it's really important. I think as others have mentioned, personal story is a really important part of engaging with folks who don't necessarily agree with what you're bringing up, because again, it gives people a different perspective on you and the legislation.
Great, thank you. So we're hearing a lot about how effective phone calls are, especially on the federal level. So how effective are phone calls on the state level? Let's just say I'm not shy about getting on the phone. That's an easier thing for me to do. What are phone calls to the offices of our senators and reps, are they effective?
I can jump into that. So most of the time, we've done phone banking to our senators and reps, and sometimes they don't pick up the phone. Sometimes they do. You'll be lucky enough and probably a aide picks up the phone, but it's always to like if they don't pick up the phone, leave a voicemail. Um, I've heard that some of our reps and senators actually do listen to our voicemail. I don't really know which ones are the ones, but it's also important because they hear from their constituents calling them nonstop, and it's probably you're calling every day to tell them to support, let's say at HB 6889, then they're gonna know that their constituents are actually caring and calling them to make these changes and support the bills that are happening.
I'll just add too, I mean, the state legislature in Connecticut, as we know, is part-time. And at the federal level, full-time staffers, full-time this and that, and that phone calls are really effective. And generally, I think it's a good time to call your federal representatives. But at the state level, because it is part-time, folks have full-time jobs. Generally speaking, our experience has been email is definitely the most effective way to reach people. Some representatives are way more, and senators are way more responsive than others, but they generally don't have staffs and full-time opportunities. So in terms of building that rapport that Kirk was talking about, the when really matters, and emailing is probably better. Generally, even just trying to find out who your rep is, being active in your community, in your town, having that relationship. When they're part-time and there's 1,000 bills going on and they already know you, even just casually meeting at a farmer's market or something, they're going to respond to you whether they agree with you or not because they know you. And for the most part, even folks that I disagree with, they generally care about representing their community and want to be accountable to it at that local level. So that does matter a lot. It's the when you build up that relationship is really important, and that's easy to do. The upside of having a part-time legislature is they are out in your community. They're there. You're much more likely to get them. They're not these big, kingly figures on some tower somewhere. So you can access them in a pretty meaningful way. So building that rapport early matters. And let's be cynical. If it's even folks that you think agree with you might not always agree with you and will kind of say yes. So building up that rapport gives you a better sense too of getting that response from people and knocking on doors for them, making some phone calls during the campaigns for or against them. They all are human beings, and politicians are pretty kind of keep score. So even if you're opposed to somebody and have worked on their opponents, they're probably going to want to talk to you because there might be some residual concern of, oh, well, this person's going to really work hard against me if I don't respond to them. So that's politics. It's not just that day of the hearing or afterwards, right? It's that continual relationship building that others have talked about.
And that's a great point. And many legislators have been holding, like updates. Session has just started. So even showing up at their updates is, to your point, Pete, showing up and building relationships. So we do have a couple of questions, so I'm going to go to this. So to audience questions. So this person's question has to do with advocacy in a more informal way. Speaking to family, friends, neighbors in my community who may not agree with me about these issues and want to have a productive conversation. What are some tips? So this is about, starting to lay some groundwork for other forms of advocacy. So how do I talk to my neighbor? We might not agree, we might agree. So how do we start?
I'd say this. I would say, and this might be hard, but don't judge them, right? Like, I think that many times people approach these kind of conversations with a judgmental kind of approach. And we say like, oh, how could you be against this? Or how could you be for that? And you just can't believe it and you're flabbergasted. But I think that that does more harm than good. I think particularly with people who we have personal and close relationships with, we should be more open-minded, and we should be more open to listening than speaking. I think it's important for us to understand perspectives from people, and then be able to share our perspectives in a respectful manner. And I think that what happens, what I like to go back to in these kinds of situations is, if it's someone you're in a relationship with, whether it's your friends or your family or your neighbors, do you want to be right, or do you want to be in a right relationship with the person, right? You know what I mean? And sometimes we strive so hard to be right that we lose the relationship. So I would say that we should keep an open mind. We should be able to be flexible and be able to agree to disagree when necessary, particularly if you want to be in a right relationship with the person.
Thank you. Good advice. Thank you. So here's another question when you testify. Do you need to begin with, I oppose or support a specific bill? This person was a little concerned and was a little confused. So is it, I mean, typically, from personal point of view, that's how I write my testimony or speak my testimony. Would you agree? I'm looking at Calder. Would you agree that up front you should say, I support or I oppose?
I think it's handy to do. I think it's certainly the convention. There are a few conventions. Many people begin by saying thank you, esteemed members, and stuff like that. You don't necessarily need to follow every kind of, it's not a problem if you commit a faux pas in your testimony. You're there to speak to them and to tell your story. That's the most important thing. I do think it can be handy for your own frame of reference. And in certain cases, if there's a lot of bills on the docket, you might get asked a follow-up question, but just saying, hey, just for our records, with which bill are you speaking in regard, yada, yada, yada. So I think it can be very handy to position it up front. There is not an ironclad rule saying that you need to do so. But I also, when practicing my testimony, tend to throw it in there at the beginning, just because it's a nice little anchor that you can use for your own frame of reference as you're chatting through your kind of whole deal. So.
Great. And you can also repeat it at the end, right? Complete that circle to emphasize your point. I'm going to look for a quick answer on this one. This is from someone who is saying they're not an expert on housing bill language, but have testified more than once. So how can we effectively get to our point without going over the 3-minute mark with just our personal, simple story? I always say practice, practice, practice. So any thoughts here? I think earlier, folks, I think maybe Pete and maybe all of you have said this, you can submit written testimony, which could be longer than, right? Can include more information than your spoken testimony. And then for your 3-minute testimony, you know, the highlights of your personal story. I mean, what are you all thinking? Pete?
Yeah, I mean, 3 minutes is not a lot of time, and maybe get questions, maybe not. Maybe have a relationship with or an organizing group or legislator and know that's coming. But generally speaking, you're not really going to change people's minds per se. It is about telling your story. So, the baseball analogy, like, don't worry about hitting a home run, worry about getting on base and making your particular point. Like, if it's broadly just we need this bill because X, Y, Z, my experience, that's powerful and that's meaningful. If you have a particular concern about, hey, this bill didn't go strong enough here, I'd like to see that changed, you can accomplish one thing in those 3 minutes. And generally speaking, the best bet is tell your story and why you're so passionate about it. And you can definitely cover that in 3 minutes. But, maybe this person sounds like they've done it a few times. They probably are following this stuff. And if there's something that you say, hey, this would be great if this was in here, or I don't understand that, that could actually spark a good conversation. You might say, hey, I really, really support this bill, but I don't understand why this is here. It doesn't make sense to me. That chair might have a conversation with you, and you might actually provide some value for everybody when there's, oh, maybe other people weren't aware of that or something. So get on base. Don't worry about the home run. And you might actually accomplish more by highlighting one particular thing that you have a question on or something like that. I mean, as annoying as these things can be and as theateristic as they can be, they're still meaningful because they can reveal information and where things need to be improved, and all those things are very beneficial. So even if it's a question, you're like, I like this, but I don't understand it. That's still helpful for the process.
Great. And I think you've also all made the point, it's worth repeating. Not everybody has to say the same thing, right? So, everybody has different expertise. An attorney is going to speak differently than I'm going to speak, or my neighbor is going to speak. So, just keep in mind, in your story, you're the expert of your story, which is what everybody's been making that point. So here's an interesting question. Are there shifts in strategy or changes to messaging that you are all implementing in light of the current presidential administration?
I can talk a little bit more about that. I feel like there has been a lot of shifts and changes, at least this year in legislative session. Even going back to the first question I was asked, like, how is it bringing these folks up to Hartford? With this administration, it has been very scary, right? They don't want to expose themselves. They don't want they have the fear of wherever they might go, something bad might happen, like ICE might be there and they might get, arrested and things like that. And no matter how much we advocate and we are doing like know your rights trainings and advocate for, that we have our rights as also as undocumented people, it's just harder because like Trump has been very scary to the undocumented community, that it has affected a lot of the power and the stories that that have also been impacted in our communities to reach to our legislators, at least from this administration experience and this 2025 experience. It has been less of the turnout in our community into advocating up in the Capitol.
Great, thank you. We have 5 minutes left, and just want to focus a little bit locally. I know all of your organizations, or a number of your organizations, do conduct training on how to testify locally. But pretty much it sort of applies, right? You have a time limit locally. It may be less formal. You may not have to sign up. You can just show up at the public hearing and raise your hand to speak. So is it important? I think the question really is it important for us to show up or send in written testimony to our local planning and zoning boards and commissions? Anyone who'd like to take that?
I'll briefly say,
Yes.
yes, it's extremely important to participate as much as is possible for you. Giselle just talked about the fact that we're in an environment that is increasingly hostile to people, particularly undocumented and the unhoused. So speaking on their behalf is even more important than it was before. And Kirk earlier talked about the importance of sustaining a fight and staying in the fight. It's not about what you do on one day. It's about a consistent participation from you and your community. So as much as you can do on the local level I think it's all to the good.
Okay, terrific. Thank you for that. So I think, some final thoughts. I'm going to look to Kirk and all of you, of course, for some final thoughts. Last words of advice. We've heard some recurring themes here today, which have been very important. So final thoughts, everybody. We have a couple minutes left. Who would like to go first? And if no one would like to go first, I'm going to look at Kirk.
Sure. But before I go, Pete, you were going to say something. You came off mute. Were you going to say something? Okay. Yeah. I mean, so for final thoughts, I'll say this. I mean, again, I just want to thank you for having us here, Yvonne, and having this conversation. Thank you for what you do with Fairfield County Talks Housing. It's a really important platform, particularly in Fairfield County, to really discuss this issue. And I want to say that housing advocacy really is a hard fight, but I truly believe it's a fight that we can win. All these people here on this call are strong advocates and fighters for this issue, lose countless amount of sleep and time with our family because we believe that this is a fight that we can win, but we can only win if we show up. Housing is power. It determines who can live in a community, who can thrive, and who gets left behind. And right now, the people who show up, the ones who make the loudest noise, they often stand in the way of progress. That means if people like us don't step up, the policies that shape our neighborhoods will be written without us. But here's the truth. We have more power than we think. And I think the Tenants Union is a great show of that. They show when we organize, we can shift the conversation. When we testify, we shape the decisions that lawmakers make. When we show up again and again, we win. Officials, whether local or on a state level, they listen to the voices in the room. So you have to be in the room. If all they hear are people saying, not in my backyard, then that's what they'll believe is happening in their community. That's what they think people in their community think. So we need to be in the room. We need to take up space. We need to make it clear that housing is a human right, and we are here to fight for it. As Giselle just mentioned, we are living in a time where the stakes are too high, and we can't afford to sit any of this work out. So if you believe that everyone deserves a stable home, you need to show up. If you believe in a stronger, more open communities, then you need to speak up. And if you believe in justice, don't let someone else decide these things for you. This isn't just about politics. This is literally about people. This is about families. This is about children. This is about people who need affordable homes, workers who are priced out of their cities and towns that they grew up with, seniors struggling with high rents and rising costs, and the next generation of young people who deserve better. You don't need to be an expert on these issues to make an impact. You need to be an expert on you, as has been said many times today. You need to be present and you need to be in the fight. We can win, but only if you show up. And I'm ready for you to join this work. And I'll see you at some public hearing or some public meeting in your local community soon.
Well, thank you. And please, I want to redirect everybody again to the links in the chat. Want to thank everybody here today. Kirk Wesley from Open Communities Alliance, Pete Harrison, RPA, the Connecticut director, but representing Desegregate CT as well. We have Calder, Hudson from the Connecticut's Tenants Union, and Giselle Chavez from Make the Road Connecticut. Really want to thank you all and our audience for taking the time today to join us for this important conversation. Also need to thank our sponsor, the Housing Collective, and our partners, the Partnership for Strong Communities, Fairfield County's Community Foundation, and Local Initiative Support Corporation, as we all work together to deliver safe, equitable, affordable housing solutions for families and individuals across Connecticut. So stay informed, connect to those links, and please also sign up for our newsletter so we can also keep you abreast of all things going on throughout the state as well as within Fairfield County. So thank you all again, and we will see you advocating, whether it's in Hartford or locally here in Fairfield County. Thanks. Have a great day, everybody.